Hey there, welcome back. Thanks for sticking with us. Lisa here, and you are now knowledgeable of all of the basics of how to put a project together, which leads us to our final project. We're going to make this lovely dress. I have designed this dress just for you. I call it the Princess Seam Dress Fit for a Princess because this seam right here is called the Princess Seam, fun fact, and I styled it after something the lovely Kate Middleton would wear. All right, well, I have a feeling you're super ready to get started. So let's jump right in. All you're gonna need is the pattern pieces, which have been provided for you with this tutorial, about 2 yards of fabric, some bias tape, ask for either just a strip or a yard, a zipper, and then your basic sewing essentials. You might need pinking shears, those are optional. Let's do this. All right, we are back and we're getting our fabric ready. So what I'm doing is matching my selvages on the top and making sure my fold is nice and even on the bottom. I need to align it just right so that all my pattern pieces will fit together and look beautiful after they're cut. So there we go, a nice smooth fabric. It's laid out so the grain is flat. Okay, so we've lined up our fabric and now we have our pattern pieces. These I actually designed just for you, and they might look a little different than the ones I'm working with because I taped these together myself. Yours might be nice and pretty and printed out all in one piece. But the most important thing to know and to remember from our lesson earlier is that this line right here, you're getting a picture of that? This line right here means center fold. So we're gonna put it on, or not center fold, but on fold. CF stands for center front. But whenever we see this, we want to make sure they're on the fold. So I'm going to line up these on the fold. This one is on the fold as well. These are part of the collar of the inside of our bodies, which we're making here. So I flipped this one upside down, which is very much allowed, especially when it's on the fold. And then these two, I just want to make sure they're lined up on the grain. This is the grain. Since the fabric that I have chose to work with looks the same, whether it is upright or, the long way, the grain can either be here or here. But if you had a pattern that you were working with that you really liked, you would always want to make sure the pattern is upright, which is why the grain is very important. So I'm laying them out. Looks like everything fits well right here. When you lay out your pieces, the less amount of space that you can take up is the better. All right, so we pin them all in place so they stay when we're cutting them. Some people use weights for this. I don't have weights, which is why I'm pinning them. Since you're a beginner, you probably don't have weights either. But they are fun to work with because they save you the trouble of pinning. There's also a level of trust involved with weights, though. You have to trust your hand to cut right. Okay, so this one I know is on the center fold. These ones I'm aligning on the grain, and I want to eyeball it, but just to make sure, I'm going to take my ruler out and make sure it's perfect. So it looks like I've got, let's see, 12.5 to the edge. Let's make sure this is also 12.5. Oh, look at that. It needs to go a little this way. So this is all part of lining up your garment just right. 12.5, 12.5. All right, so that's perfectly on the grain. We're going to pin it. There we go. So something to keep in mind is these are cut to. That's the description. And when you cut out one, you're really cutting out two because the fabric has, it's doubled over itself. So that is the beauty of cutting on the fold versus cutting two. When you lay everything out, it works. You don't even have to think about it. All right. So we've now laid out all of our pieces. They're perfectly on the grain. They're not taking up too much room. It's time to cut them out. I'm using my rotary wheel. However, it's not a rotary wheel, that would be redundant. It's a rotary blade, and you can use your fabric scissors, whichever one you have, and cutting them out very carefully. Keep in mind that the fabric, or this pattern, has a 1/2 inch seam allowance included. Oh, you know what? We need to notch our garment before we cut it. So let's do that as well. If you've noticed, there's some little triangles in all of these pieces. So what we want to do is make sure that these triangles show up are transferred to the fabric. These are called notches. So whenever I see a triangle, I'm just going to draw that on directly onto my fabric. Just little tiny steps. It really doesn't matter if you do this before or after you cut. Actually, it might be easier after I cut, I'm noticing. But you want to make sure they're there before you remove the pattern piece from the garment, or from the fabric. Also, I accidentally just cut the paper with my blade. I want to avoid doing that as much as possible, because then the blade will go dull. All right, so we've got one. Another rule of thumb, which I've mentioned earlier, is always cut away from you, so your fingers don't come off. All right, slow and steady. Okay, so I cut out all my pieces. As you can see, they kind of left behind a fun little imprint on our fabric. I usually cut off all the annoying pieces because we really can't use that we can never really use that, but I'm just going to put it aside for now. Now I just want to once again mention how important it is to get all of your notches before you remove the pattern piece from the fabric. So what I have here are my notches. They express the sides, or the pieces that will be put together and attached to a different piece of fabric. So all I have to do is add a notch on the fabric itself where the notches are. I'm using a Sharpie so that you can see. Please don't use a Sharpie on your own fabric. Use a pencil or chalk because those erase quickly. A Sharpie is permanent. So the different notches, as I mentioned before in the tutorials, are like there's 3 on this one because they'll be matched up to the other 3. You'll see, it all makes sense. Okay, we also have this dart that we're going to be working with. I'm just going to put one dot right at the tip of where the dart is going to end. It's right there. I'm going to do the same thing for the other side. The best way to know is I'm just sticking a pin through it. I'm going to mark it right there. That will be very useful later. So basically, anytime your pattern piece has any markings on it, transfer them. All right, we've pinned everything. Let's take off our pieces and let's get started with actually sewing. I'm going to begin with my front piece and my side piece. I'm going to set these to the side for now. I like to keep the paper on them just to keep them organized. Okay, we've got our front of our bodice and the sides of our bodice and the princess seam, which is the line that contours the bust. Okay, so we're putting our front piece to our side seams. Notice how there's 2 notches here and 2 notches here. What we want to do is attach them all together so they match. So I'm going to set that aside for now. And I'm going to line up my notches and pin them together. Once I've got that, I know that those are going to meet at one point, and I want the top of my princess seam to match to the top of the body's front. I'm going to pin that. I'm going to pin the bottom. The rest is the fun part. That's when I get to manipulate my fabric to fit. It's going to have a curve naturally, just as the bust curves. So we work our way in, we work the fabric in the rest of the way. It's just a matter of kind of stretching, and after you sew it and clip it, it'll work a lot better. But it's a little awkward at first. So I'm just pinning it together. Okay, so we've pinned our princess seam in place. Time to sew it together. We're using 1/2 inch seam allowance, as I mentioned earlier. Before you sew, make sure your machine is good to go. I have it on the straight stitch, 2.5 inch length, 0 width. All right, so back stitch and remove pins as you go. Since this curve is a little awkward, please take your time and make sure that the fabric is as smooth as possible as you sew it. All right. Okay, so we've got one side done. Before we start getting fancy, we're gonna do the other side as well. I'm gonna do the same exact thing where I take my side, I make sure that the right sides are together, meaning the side that's going to be showing when you wear it, and we pin. Okay, so I have now sewn both of my princess seams, just like discussed. Now we have to finish them and clip them. Finishing is a very important part of your process, which we have not done yet. So to finish your seams, I showed you a few different ways in the past tutorial. Let's just do the easiest one, which was pinking. So what I'm gonna do is just open up this seam. I'm gonna press it open with my iron over here. Okay, so I'm pressing my seam open with an iron. If you have a tailor's ham, this would be a great time to use it. The tailor's ham is a kind of a rounded ironing board. It's like a little rounded block, and it makes pressing open curves much easier. We don't have one of those, so I'm just being careful. And we have a semi-flat seam. It's still a little awkward because of the curve, which we will solve in just a second. I want to finish my seam by stitching right next to the seam line, so just 1/8 of an inch away. I'm going to stitch the entire length of that, only catching the unfinished edge. So just this very thin part of the seam right next to it. The needle is right there next to the edge. Okay, I've now stitched right next to my seam. Now what I'm gonna do to finish it is use my pinking shears to cut off all this fray. I'm just cutting along kind of halfway down the middle, and just cutting off all that fray, and then that will ensure that this seam will not come out, the garment will not fray, and you'll have a beautiful finished piece. You're going to do this on every single seam you make. It's tedious, but worth it. Okay, now you can tell I have finished both of my seams. It might not be the prettiest, but it's gonna stay in place, and that's what matters. Now I also understand that this is your very first sewing project, so if you want to skip seam finishing, I'm not gonna judge. So the last thing we have to do is it's called clipping the corners, which we talked about before in the tutorials. And what that means is just finding our curve, taking our handy dandy snips and cutting out some of the fabric so it will round the corner better. And what I'm doing here, my technique is following, or I don't want to cut beyond our seam finish line, so that 1/8 of an inch that we reserved for the seam finish. So I'm just cutting out little triangles. It's kind of hard to see with this fabric because it frays a lot, but what I'm doing is basically allowing the fabric to curve without pulling. I'm opening up and I'm freeing it. So I've clipped out my seams, my curves. Now I'm just ironing it once again to make sure everything is nice and smooth. It's kind of hard to tell, but maybe you'll notice that it's a little bit easier to iron this time. All right, and that concludes the very first little tiny part, the body's front. Now let's put our back together. Yay, back. So we're gonna do the same thing as before. Match up your notches. You want your right sides together. So this needs to be on this side. This needs to be on this side. Perfect. Right sides together. And all you need to do is align your notches as well as keep the top and bottom in line. They should basically line up perfectly. This is a very easy stitch. I'm just going to pin it at the top and bottom and sew that in a straight line. I'm also going to finish it just as we did before. After that one, I will align my sleeves, or not my sleeves, but the shoulder seam is what we call the seam up here. So once again, align the notches, align the ends, pin, and we're basically just going to straight stitch those, finish them. You don't need to clip them because they are straight. And let's take care of that. Okay, so I have now attached all of the sides and back of my bodice. We are just about ready to add the final touches to the first part of our dress. Now I do want to rewind and talk about a mistake I made. I was not quite finished cutting out all of my pieces yet, so I just want you to know the center back, when we cut it out, is going to be cut to, not cut on fold. I redid it with seam allowance, so I just want that to be out in the open. Your pieces that you're working with will be perfect. So if there was a question earlier, it's solved. Also, our next step is to create the dart in the back of the dress so that it'll fit better. So to do that, you have where your dart is going to meet right here where you marked, and you're going to pinch that fabric together so it meets here and put that together. My model actually does not require a dart in her back. I actually put it on her to fit and she did not need it, so I'm not going to do it to this dress, but all you would need to do if you were doing it is put it in your machine. You would do a straight line up to this point, and then you wouldn't back stitch, but you would take it out of your machine and then take the 2 threads and tie them in a knot, and that would be a dart. Okay, so now to finish the back the way we want, we are going to add the collar lining that I created. So I'm taking it off of my pattern pieces, and all we're gonna do is first we connect them just like we did with the shoulder seams. So we're treating it as its own separate entity from the garment. So let's see. These are the shoulder seams. We want them to, it's more important that they line up on the inside. So we're gonna just put them together here and here. I don't need to worry about seam finishing them or anything because they're gonna be on the inside. No one will ever see them. I'm just gonna sew them up real quick. All right. Now we are going to essentially just pin it into our garment. We want the right sides to be together. So I'll put this so the right side is looking at me. I'll put this over it. And most importantly, I want to line up the seams. So I'll pin this here. Pin this here. And then just pin everything else so it stays in place. And it follows the raw edges of the bodies. And now I'm just going to sew all of that in place. A trick for doing this, I know you're gonna hate me, but the trick is you start from the center and you work your way down, and then you start from your center again and you work your way down. And that is, you do that so if the fabric stretches at all, you still have it evenly in the middle. Let's sew that right up. And once again, I'm keeping my 1/2 inch seam allowance. Something else I might not have mentioned is I'm using black thread, mainly so that you can follow along and see more easily what I'm doing, but I would definitely recommend working with thread that matches the color of your garment. Also, as I go over this seam here, I want to make sure that the other side is folded out so there will be no bulk once it's done. All right. Now I have my collar. I want to clip the corners and curves once again. Notice how this time around my curve is going in instead of out, like it was with the princess seam. When it goes in, all you have to do is clip little notches, just little vertical marks. And that'll help the fabric also, give it room to move. So I'm just gonna make as many as I need to. Especially around the big turns where the sleeve is. Every once in a while, make sure you check your machine. It looks like if you see this here, the thread is a little zigzagged. I don't want it to be doing that, so I'm just gonna adjust my, the tension on my machine to make it less so that it'll be a little bit tighter, but this won't hinder the final appearance. All right, look how nice and straight that became. Remember when it was all curved? Now it's gonna open up nice and straight. Let's iron it. So first, we take our iron and we open up the seam. Always open it out. Okay, so I've opened up my seam with the iron. Now I'm going to fold it over, and I want to iron this edge nice and flat so that so that both ends are folded over and you have a crisp, even finish. Okay, now the beauty of this is when you turn it right side out, you'll notice that I have a nice clean finished neckline. Perfect. Another thing you're gonna wanna do, we can do this once we're done with everything else, but take some thread and tack down the collar, probably to the neckline right here where the seam is, and then it'll stay in place. Okay, the last thing we need to add to this bodice, this is now when we need our bias tape. So I'm going to measure out enough tape to cover the entire circle. The arm's eye is what we call the opening for your arm. So let's see, measuring this out. Okay, I'm gonna cut a little more than enough. And let's do this. This is now how to apply bias tape to finish a raw edge. We're gonna open up our tape. So you notice how bias tape is actually just fabric that has been cut into strips while folded on the bias. So it's all very diagonal, and then it's folded over like that, which makes this tape is ideal for like hemming and things. So I'm actually going to work with this on the outside. So I'm going to pin this along the right side of my garment. I'm going to align this this seam, the folded edge of my bias tape along the seam allowance of my arm's eyes. So it looks kind of like it's just floating here in the middle. That is 1/2 inch from the edge, so the seam allowance. So I'm just gonna pin that in place all the way around my garment, my arm's eye. So this is now a complete arm's eye pinned with bias tape. What we're gonna do is put it in our machine. I'm removing the front compartment of my machine. I'm setting it to the side so that we have room for this circle to go in and move freely around. So what we're gonna do is start along the seam. That's always a good place to start, where the bottom of your sleeve. And I'm just gonna sew along the folded line. Yeah. Okay. All right, we sewed that in a complete circle. Now what we get to do is fold over our bias tape, encase the raw edge, press it, and have it disappear. Let me show you this way. We're folding it over, we're encasing the raw edge, and we're going to press our sleeve so that this is what it'll look like all the way around. So first, to get that nice flat finish, I'm gonna add some clips. I'm gonna clip out here and this way. Now we take our handy dandy mini ironing board, which is perfect because this is in fact an ironing board fit for a sleeve that I've been using as my mini sidekick. And we basically fold it over here. See that, how it just cases it nicely, and put it that way. I'm just gonna pin it. Gonna pin it in place. And I'm gonna do that all the way around. And then I'll show you how to stitch it shut in just a moment. All right, so this is actually what the finished inside arm's eye will look like. It has a nice crisp black lining, which is perfect. That's what the bias tape does. I kind of jumped ahead but I'm gonna show you how I did it here on this little sample. I just used a basic hidden slip stitch. I started my thread underneath here. There's a knot in my thread, and it's just gonna stay there. And then all I do is catch one or two very little tiny pieces of string of the inside of my garment. I pull, and then I stick my needle through the tunnel here on the fold, just about a 1/4 inch. I remove my pin, pulling it, and I'm just gonna keep doing the same thing where I catch a few pieces of string right there. It's really hard to see because it's so tiny. And the trick is if you barely catch any, you won't even see it on this side. And then you go back through the fold, and you just keep doing that all along the inside. So that is the step you do after you pin your hem in place. And you just do it all the way around, and then you have a basic, nice, clean, finished sleeves. Ready to go, no raw edges. So that is a basic bodice. Now it's kind of missing something, right? It's missing the skirt. It's time to make this guy a complete dress. So I have a surprise for you. The skirt of the dress is actually going to be, you have 2 options. Option 1, do you remember when we made this? Our lovely elastic waisted skirt. You can either use this or find a skirt that you already have. And we're going to use, I love this one. It's a nice little swing pattern, a little swing shape. And you can use this to trace a skirt, which you can make. So in one of my tutorials, which you have seen, we discussed how you can make pattern pieces out of existing pieces of clothing. All you have to do is trace them over the fabric, which is what we're about to do. So once, as we did earlier, I'm lining up my fabric so that the selvage edges are touching up here. They follow the grain all the way down, and then I have my fold here on the bottom. Now all I need to do is lay out my skirt. I have the seam of the skirt here lined up against the folded edge of this fabric. I'm going to open this up all the way. Perfect. Lining all that up. Okay, it's as simple as this. I have my wheel. I'm just gonna cut out the skirt, leaving a little bit of room for seam allowance and error. Also going to follow this line directly up, just because I feel like that will be more complete. Following the arc of the skirt. Okay, so that is our swing skirt shape. It's going to look so great. Now we get to put it together. So I'm laying open my bodice, right side up. And, okay, so here's our 2 options once again. Where'd my elastic skirt go? So what I could either do is, if you chose to go with the beautiful elastic skirt you already made, all you would need to do is cut open this seam right here, which you sewed shut, and lay it out so that the center of your skirt matches the center here, and then have the ends of the skirt meet here, and then just pin all of the rest of your skirt pre-gathered in place, and it would all fit and it would totally work. You would sew right along there. I wanted to keep my elastic skirt so that I could wear them separately, so I made this new one. All I'm going to do is line up the center fold with the center of my bodice and pin it in place. Okay, so I have now pinned my skirt in place. The edges are aligned from the bodice and the top of the skirt. The skirt ended up being a little bit longer. It extends the length of the bodice, but that is totally okay because we're gonna fix that up when we sew it. So now I just need to sew in a straight line 1/2 inch seam allowance, making these, sewing them together. That was simple, wasn't it? Now I'm just gonna finish that and add a zipper as our last touch. Woohoo! I have a super easy way to add a zipper. You actually sew up the dress first and then add the zipper over it. It's kind of cheating, but it's really easy, so I think you'll love it. Let's do it. So let's start with right sides together, as we know. Right sides together. We want to make sure everything is nice and in line so that our dress comes together at the same place. Whew, this fabric sure does like to shred, and that is why we finish everything. So I'm lining up where the seams meet here on the bottom. I also need to press this open still. Now let's just take our shears and cut off all that extra bulk and frayed edges. We do not like frayed edges. They're ugly. Take that. And up here, just a little bit. I don't want to mess with my seam allowance too much, but this will help us. If you are working with a fabric that frays easily like this, I recommend actually pinking all of the edges after you cut out the pieces the very first time. It'll just keep them from fraying. Okay, now we're so close to being done. Oh my gosh, I'm so proud of you guys for sticking with it. We're so close. It's time to add that zipper, my super secret. Okay, it might be tricky for some of you, but let's see. Okay, here's our zipper. I chose this lovely blue color to match my fabric. So all I'm doing here is pinning my zipper in place. It is face down over the open seam allowance on the back seam. And I'm catching both ends of the zipper. So if you need a visual here, this is the open seam allowance. This is my zipper, face down. It's an invisible zipper, so you really can't see the teeth on this side. And once we stitch this in, we can cut open the seam, and then our zipper will look fabulous. Okay, we've now pinned the zipper. We just have to sew it up. I'm gonna show you some fancy things I did over here first, though. I've taken the regular presser foot out of the machine. I took it out of the storage box. I'm putting that aside, and I'm putting my zipper presser foot into the machine. I also changed threads because this thread is actually going to show, so I kind of wanted it to match my dress a little better. All right, now we've got our zipper ready to go, ready to sew. Oh, let's put the zipper foot on this side. There we are. So we just start it up here, and then we top stitch our way down. Fairly simple. I moved the zipper head down a little so that the bulk wouldn't be in the way. Now we're doing this again. Okay, this is actually a good length for our zipper. So we're going to turn. I'm putting the needle into the machine. I'm rotating 90 degrees. Let's just cut this. I don't know what this is. And now I'm going to jump over. I'm going to put it back in the machine, and then I'm going to jump back. I'm just doing this manually. Some people do it on their machine. I want to just do it manually, where I'm jumping back and forth over the end and back this way. This is going to keep the zipper in place, or from getting pulled too low. Okay, just did that a few times. Now we rotate our machine 90 degrees, or our fabric again 90 degrees, all at once. Big hunkin' piece of fabric. With our presser foot up, put that presser foot back down, and get ready to sew the other way. Boom. We have a zipper now. Lovely. I'm going to open up that back seam that we sewed earlier. Just tearing that open. Oh yeah. And that is basically our dress. All we have left is needing to hem. All you have to do is double under half an inch, and then top stitch along the hem, and it will be perfect. Let's get my model in this dress and see what it looks like.